So, branching off of the context of the civil rights movement, which starts in the 1950s and goes into the 1960s, we're going to look at the broader U.S. in the 1960s and the U.S. in relation to international affairs. So, as the civil rights movement was going on, JFK, or John F. Kennedy, was elected president in 1960, and he is president at a time when there's a lot of demands being made by the civil rights movement to do something, right? To respond to the protests in a way that is supporting and not, meant to put down the protests, in a, making demands in a way for the whoever is president to make a statement, to issue an executive order, to pressure the Congress or the Supreme Court to make changes, right? But with John F. Kennedy, as much as he was the youngest president elected up to that point, and people saw him as like a representation of like a younger generation and a more progressive view of America, he wasn't outspoken on challenging racism. So, for example, Martin Luther King Jr., talking about these so-called like liberal, progressive leaders, said the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice. And this was echoed in recent years in terms of, like, for example, the Black Lives Matter protests, right? There were people who were saying, these are important issues, and they are long-standing issues, and hopefully you learn that from this class. They're long-standing, ongoing issues, but often met with, kind of weight, or not like that. Don't ask for your rights like that, or, you need to be more moderate in your approaches, right? And so Kennedy and other white moderates were kind of echoing statements that had been made in the past, right? Give it time, or we have to do this slowly, or it has to be done according to law and order. But of course, for people in the civil rights movement, they knew that had not worked throughout Reconstruction, throughout lynching, throughout segregation, right? There needed to be something more extreme. Nonetheless, Kennedy was still seen as this kind of youthful, new kind of hope for America. However, he didn't speak out on racism. His brother, though, Senator Robert Kennedy, who later became presidential candidate, Robert Kennedy, was more directly outspoken on civil rights. And so there he is in the bottom picture. In the top picture, you have Kennedy in a televised debate with Nixon, and part of that debate kind of showcased this youthful Kennedy that appealed to many people. And then in the bottom picture there, that's Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, with Martin Luther King Jr. He was, Robert Kennedy did show up at, protests. He was engaged with activists. He was outspoken. Another major cause that he supported was farm workers' rights, right? So he was much more like of a hope for those who were looking for kind of this more extreme or radical change. However, in 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Texas, and then in 1968, the same year as Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles, in the Ambassador Hotel, which is not there anymore. I believe there's a high school in its place, but he was assassinated there. All right, so all of these assassinations, right? You have like JFK, you have Malcolm X, you have Martin Luther King Jr., you have Robert F. Kennedy, in the 60s, all within the 60s, at a very turbulent time when, it's very chaotic, and there's like this potential for a really great change, and you have these leaders who are proposing different changes, but a lot of violence surrounding it. And the U.S.'s kind of turbulence and violence is actually can be set in a broader international context of a lot of change, right? If we pan back out and we think about what was going on in the world in terms of kind of these new countries that are seeking liberation, the fight between communism and capitalism, new, revolutions all over the place. You're going to read a little bit more about this, tying together that international context with what's happening in the United States. You're going to read about escalating tensions in Cuba and Berlin in terms of communism, the Cuban Missile Crisis with the United States, and JFK in Vietnam. And these are all connected. And so you'll read about these and answer these 3 questions here, continuing on with a writing assignment in 14. You are going to describe the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Kennedy's actions in Vietnam. After John F. Kennedy's assassination, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president. And it is actually going to be Lyndon Johnson, an seemingly unlikely person to do so, who is going to be able to usher in and push forward a lot of the demands and changes related to the civil rights movement. John F. Kennedy was a Northern Democrat, right? He's like a, New England, northeastern kind of, Boston, Catholic Democrat that appealed to a lot of northern city folks. And when he was running, in order to kind of get the other Democrats, he chose Lyndon Johnson as his running mate, because Lyndon Johnson was a Southern Democrat from Texas, right? So you have the Democratic Party, remember, shifting and splitting, and eventually the Southern Democrats moving to the Republican Party. But at this time, this was a time of transition. And so for Kennedy to win, he had his Northern Democratic votes. He needed a vice president that was a Southern Democrat. And by being a Southern Democrat, he also not only was friends with Southern Democrats, but kind of allowed for the Democratic platform to be more expansive. Instead of just focusing on city issues, Lyndon Johnson was more attuned with like Southern poverty and poverty in general, and also with issues going on with the civil rights movement, especially rooted in the South, right? So he was a Southerner, but he was a centrist, a moderate as well, who was more connected with both the Southern Democrats and the Northern Democratic Party through his party, that he was able to get more support from his friends who were Southern Democrats, and then the people that he worked with in the broader Democratic Party, in order to get support for bills that were what the civil rights movement was pushing for. Right? And so he met with, they had a difficult relationship for sure, a working relationship, but he met with Martin Luther King Jr. and other activists, and as did the leaders of the Democratic Party, and eventually under Lyndon Johnson, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 gets passed. And this is a congressional bill that gets passed and becomes an act that bans discrimination in public places, in housing and employment. So all of those government programs that were openly discriminating or supporting segregation, now that was not allowed. And so programs that were getting government funding could no longer segregate, could no longer openly discriminate against people who are applying for employment, for housing, people who are going into public places and public programs. The following year, 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed, which banned the restrictions to voting that the civil rights movement was pushing for. All of those literacy tests, poll taxes, the open terrorism and violence before elections now was going to be addressed by making voting a federal matter, in the sense that now federal officials are money is set aside for there to be federal officials dedicated to overseeing elections, to make sure that they are being conducted fairly, and that people are not being excluded from their constitutional right to vote. You also had in 1965 the Immigration and Nationality Services Act, which in effect would take away all of those unfair quotas that limited who could immigrate to the United States based on their country of origin. And so if you recall, most of Asia was banned from immigrating to the United States, this 1965 Act is going to eliminate that ban on Asian immigration. And so a lot of times in history, people talk about pre-65 immigration and post-65 immigration. After 1965 is when you begin to see large populations of Asian immigration in the United States, or Asian immigrants in the United States. And the whole kind of makeup of who is immigrating to the United States is going to completely change. From the very controlled attempt to, or attempts to control the makeup of immigration to make it primarily European, now it's going to completely change and create the population we have in the United States today. All right, so we're going to continue on with our writing assignment here. You're going to read a section called The New Liberal Experiment and one called Lyndon Johnson and the War on Poverty. And then you're going to answer number 6 here about the war on poverty and its impacts. So just a brief overview of the war on poverty and this great society that Lyndon Johnson proposed to create. A couple of things that were passed under Johnson in respect of poverty, addressing poverty: 1965 Economic Opportunity Act, changes in Medicare and Medi-Cal to expand how many people could have access to health insurance, 1965 Higher Education Act, which is going to create things like work-study and Cal grants, create financial aid opportunities to allow more people access to higher education. 1965 HUD gets created, the Housing and Urban Development Act, right, to again increase more publicly subsidized, or public housing that's government subsidized, Section 8 housing and so on. So really kind of looking at the core rights of housing, the core rights of education, the core rights of food, the core rights of access to employment opportunities. These are the things that were being addressed. So after he served out the rest of Kennedy's term as president, right, Johnson served out the rest of Kennedy's term after he was assassinated, he then ran for president in 1964. And the person he was running against, who was running for president as a Republican candidate, was a extreme conservative, extreme in the 1964 context, an extreme Republican named Barry Goldwater from Arizona. And he only won one state, I believe. He only won Arizona in the end. And so Johnson got reelected. However, Barry Goldwater is would be like a model for Nixon, Reagan, Bush, Trump, right? In this increasingly extreme right-wing Republican platform. And when he ran in 64, Goldwater is the one who really began to usher in Southern segregationists, those Southern Democrats, that were aligned with the Democrats going all the way back to Reconstruction, who ushered them into the Republican Party. And you have this huge shift as Republicans much more focus on law and order. We need law and order in this country. What is this country becoming? We want to go back to the good old days when, things were, right, and America was great, and, really a dog whistle kind of for like all of these changes that are giving people more rights. A lot of these folks were opposed to. They didn't want it to change. They didn't want segregation to end. They didn't want non-white people having access to jobs and opportunities. They didn't want women to be, part of these liberation movements and kind of disrupt the traditional American sense of what a home should be and what gender roles should be and everyone's place in society. So that's a big shift that happens. And one of the things that really pushes this conservative movement is a sense of lessening patriotism, like this extreme kind of blind patriotism that we're just going to go along with whatever the United States does, even though that's never been the case. There have always been people who've been outspoken, and you've learned that in this class, right? People who are against, the Spanish-American War, people who are against World War I, the U.S. getting involved in World War I and World War II. But those voices had always been in a small minority, right? And everyone just like, well, we got to support our government and whatever it's doing in the world. But by the time you get to the civil rights movement, you have a lot of conscious raising. Like, people are really starting to examine the U.S.'s role in the world and what is really happening. What are we actually sending our troops to? Whose bidding are they doing, right? Who is it benefiting if there's still this intense poverty and mistreatment of people in the United States, right? So all these movements have been building one on top of the other. And then you kind of have a powder keg of this movement away from this kind of blind patriotism with the Vietnam War, right? And so the Vietnam War lasts from 1954 to 1975, and you're going to read a little bit about the Vietnam War and the U.S.'s role in it. In the textbook, in this section, Vietnam Containment and Tragedy, and even though it's about the Vietnam War, a section called America's War. And you're going to answer this question here about the escalating U.S. involvement in Vietnam. So many folks began to criticize the United States' increasing involvement in the Vietnam War and began to label it another Korea. If you remember, after World War II, when Japan fell, Korea was one of those colonies that now was liberated, right, is free, like all the colonies of like Germany and Italy. And the people in those colonies are like, yay, finally, like, we're free, right, and we're no longer going to be colonized, we're going to have our own country, but it's the Cold War. And so the U.S. and the Soviet Union rush right in and we're like, not so fast, you're not going to be free yet. And so in Korea, you have the division of North and South Korea, where essentially the U.S. and the Soviet Union, Russia, are playing politics on somebody else's land, right? And they divide Korea up. And up till today, there are still nationalist Koreans who are like, we want our homeland united and it to not be a place serving these other places, right? And we see how that's played out. Well, the same thing happened in Vietnam, right? Vietnam got divided because the North and the South essentially had to deal with the intervention of the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So many people are like, this is just Korea all over again. Why are we getting involved in Vietnam again? It's the same thing. And so there became an even more vocal desire to stay out. In Korea, in the Korean War, Americans were drafted into the war, and many Americans were like, what are we even fighting for? Why am I being drafted to fight? Like, I don't know who the good guys and the bad guys really are in the situation. The same thing happened in Vietnam, but even more so as you begin to have this civil rights movement and this more conscious raising and this more kind of collective resistance to whatever the government was doing. People were saying this is just about the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It's an imperialistic war where the U.S. is building its empire, the Russians are building their empire, and then the common person is dragged into this war. Many people were saying if we get involved in Vietnam, it's going to be a quagmire. I know maybe you know that name from a cartoon, but a quagmire is like a quicksand situation, where the more you struggle to get out, the more you get dragged in. And so many Americans were like, no, don't commit anything in terms of, military support, military advisors, boots on the ground, nothing, no involvement in Vietnam. However, the U.S. had an interest in getting involved in Vietnam in order to keep the Soviet Union out of it. So in 1964, you have the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution that essentially commits the U.S., where the U.S. is saying we have no choice. We resolve to get involved and defend the Vietnamese against the Soviet Union, against communism. But again, you have echoes of the Philippines. You remember, right? Like, coming in and saying we're going to save you, this paternalistic sense of like, no, we're going to get involved whether you want us to or not. We're going to get involved. The following year, the U.S. issues the draft, meaning men, 18 boys and men, 18 and over, are, in the U.S. are going to be put into this lottery system where names are essentially going to be picked at random. And if you're chosen, you have to go off to war. There were a lot of people who opposed this draft because they didn't believe in this war to begin with. They felt it was an immoral, unethical war. But also people started pointing out in the midst of the civil rights movement and a growing, a more extreme radical leftist movement, people were pointing out the gross inequalities in terms of who's getting drafted. And they're like, okay, the draft is supposed to be random, but it's not, right? You have 80% of the people being drafted are poor or working class. Blacks and Latinos are twice as likely to be drafted than white people. This is not random, right? And so many people's trust in the government was not there. Like, I'm not going to trust that you're picking me at random and I'm just going to do my patriotic duty to support a good war when none of that seems likely. And then you started to have the media, journalists, exposing a lot of the atrocities that were happening in Vietnam. You had, first in 1968, okay, so 1968 is a huge year, right? It's the year that Robert F. Kennedy is assassinated, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated, and then the Tet Offensive happens in Vietnam, where essentially this is the turning point of the war, where the Northern Vietnamese is able to breach into South Vietnam very openly and defeat American-supported forces in central Vietnam. And so this offensive becomes a big loss for the United States. And the people are like, we're not even winning. Why are we there? Let's just pull out of Vietnam now. It's not, we can't do it, right? And we're doing this for the wrong reasons, and we're sending our sons over there to die, like, in huge numbers. And then you have all these inequalities of who's being sent over to die. Then you had a whistleblower alert the media to one event called the My Lai massacre, which actually was not like a, an uncommon thing, but it was one in which you had a whistleblower. Essentially, in the My Lai massacre, U.S. troops come to a hamlet, a little village, mainly women, children, and elderly people, in order to massacre everybody there. And journalists were on the ground taking photographs. The photographs were all confiscated except for one journalist who hid his roll of film. And he documented first a lot of assaults, sexual assaults that were happening, and then the massacres of people. And so, trigger warning here, but it's a very famous photograph from the My Lai massacre. This is right after this woman has been assaulted by a U.S. soldier. Her son is trying to cover her back up, and then everybody in this photograph gets massacred. This person, I believe his name is Hugh Thompson, he was there on the ground. He and a few other soldiers were like, I'm not doing this, and they got court-martialed, and they got in trouble with the military. And if he and that journalist who held the film had not spoken up, nothing would have been done about this, right? But he and others were whistleblowers. They said, this is not right, this is not okay, and they testified in front of Congress eventually about what had happened, what they saw on the ground, helicopter that lands and essentially just massacres everyone along with the troops on the ground that are also shooting at people, civilians in this village. There was one helicopter pilot who also refused, and he said, no, I'm not going to do this, and disobeyed orders and also was court-martialed as well. So all of this is breaking news in 1968, right? The U.S. is losing the war and they're committing these atrocities on the ground, and then these leaders are being assassinated, and people are like, what is going on? This is not, we got too many problems here at home, that there's, the U.S. doesn't know what it's doing in this, in this, war in Vietnam. And so this, pushed a huge anti-war movement in the United States, which was built on already just a general sentiment that the U.S. getting involved in Vietnam was a mistake. But the U.S. was like, they've already committed so much money, so many troops, and they were in the midst of the Cold War, and they didn't want, it essentially becomes like an ego thing. They don't want to lose and say, like, we made a mistake in the eyes of the Soviet Union, right? In front of the eyes of the Soviet Union. You had moral protests against the war. You had the people who were saying the way that you are recruiting people is unethical. Not only are people being drafted, within these inequalities, they're drafting poor and black and brown folks more than others. You also are seeing, like, people began to look at, like, why are there only ROTCs and campus recruitment to the military in poor high schools? right? You're not going to see like an ROTC at Beverly Hills High School or wherever, some wealthy neighborhoods, because those are not places that the military can find recruits at. Why? Because recruitment into the military, people began to examine as being based on the fact that there is poverty in the United States. That for many people, they don't have access to the things that now that the military can offer. And if the U.S. government was actually offering, let's say, universal health care and universal higher ed, who would, really, the numbers of people joining the military would severely drop, especially during this time when there was this kind of awakening of like, of what are the U.S.'s intentions in the world around us. You had people protesting against the draft, against how much spending it was taking, and against imperialism, meaning the U.S. building its empire through these Cold War efforts as well. Martin Luther King Jr. was an outspoken anti-war activist as well, and he worked, this anti-war sentiment seamlessly into the issues of race, recognizing that they're all tied together, right? So here's a quote from him. "I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government." And so connecting what the government is doing here in the United States against people pushing for their civil rights is the same thing that's happening to people around the world who are trying to get their freedom, and then the U.S. is stepping in. And overall, violence is the weapon to silence people in both, instances. You had people resisting the draft, saying, "I'm not going to, I don't care. If you don't go when you're drafted, you get put in prison," right? And so there were people who ignored their notices. There were people who chose to go to prison instead of going to fight. There were 56,000 people who applied as conscientious observers. These are people who say because of their either religious beliefs or because of their moral and ethical beliefs, they cannot go and fight in the war. And so they apply to be a conscientious observer and say, I'm stepping out because I don't want to engage in this thing. Some people fled to other countries. People went to Canada, went to Mexico, and then ultimately you are a draft dodger. And when you come back, you will have to face the consequences. And so there are people who live without their social security numbers, afterwards because they didn't want to go fight in the war. The media coverage of the war, especially in the age, remember, this is the first major generation with television in their homes. And so people are watching TV at night and getting like news flashes and watching the local news and then seeing, this these horrific atrocities that are being committed, like in the hearings about the My Lai massacre. They're seeing images of children getting napalmed, right? Napalm is a chemical weapon. When dropped on people, it burns people's skin. It's supposed to burn intended use was to burn the trees that were providing coverage for enemy troops, according to the U.S. military, but they were dropping it where people live. And people were getting, killed and severe burns as a result. And there's a famous photograph of a little girl, a 9-year-old girl, who's running on the road with no clothes on, screaming because her clothes have been burned off by napalm. So these kind of images were being transported into people's homes on their television, and it became harder for people to ignore kind of what was happening. And then you had news about refugees that were fleeing from every place where war was breaking out in Vietnam. And of course, that's always the case in war, but now again, it's being, televised into people's homes. The anti-war movement grew more and more at college campuses. So college campuses are often, with the youth, even when we saw with the civil rights movement, you have young people who are kind of the forefront of major social movements. And so college campuses, especially those being places where you have people that are the age that are being drafted, right, were more and more protesting against the Vietnam War. And then in 1970, you had the Kent State shootings, where I believe it was a National Guard open fired on students, and students were killed in protesting the war, right? There's a famous photograph of the Kent State shootings, and these people, that woman who's screaming there, she's still alive today, right? So these are not that far back in history. A lot of the protests against the Vietnam War that were based on college campuses were building off of student movements that had been growing throughout the 1960s. And so you had in the 1960s a growth on college campuses towards what was called the grassroots democracy movement, right? Of like taking, actual government power back away from kind of these wealthy corporations and wealthy businessmen and putting power back into the hands of the people, right? Like this attempt to like really, okay, the U.S. says it's democracy. It's going around the world fighting and killing people in the name of this democracy against the Soviet Union. Well, there needs to be an actual democracy. And so people are trying to push for a true democracy where you're like letting people actually have freedom to choose. And so this intertwines with the civil rights movement where, Black people are saying we don't even have the right to vote, right? And you're going around the world trying to bring freedom to people when Americans don't have the right to vote, right? Black Americans don't have the right to vote. And so there's students on college campuses creating organizations like Students for a Democratic Society, those students overlapping with students who become part of the free speech movement, right? And saying, we have the right to protest things that are wrong. And that's what, First Amendment, freedom of assembly, is supposed to protect our rights to critique the government when the government is not serving the people. Then that, of course, melds in with the civil rights movement. It melds in with the anti-war movement. All of this is going on at a very tumultuous time. So the 1960s people talk about it as being this kind of time of social unrest and upheaval. You also have the Watts riots, and you have riots, related to the civil rights movement. And you also have these folks who are part of these movements are actually the baby boomers, right? So these are the people that are born after World War II, where they are growing up in relative economic stability, where a lot of media and culture is addressed or targeting young people. And so these young people have a sense that their voices are important, that they are powerful in some way. And so, the organizing almost, and then you have a larger population of young people, right? This boom in population that happened after World War II. Now they're college age. Now they're, meeting each other on college campuses and in organizations and then forming this movement. They also participate in a counterculture, where you have young people kind of pushing back against their parents and suburban life and this identity around respectability and having consumer goods, right? They were much more focused on personal liberation, freeing your mind, freeing your spirit, freeing your body, resistance to mainstream consumerism, the TV shows that they grew up on, with the mom, dad, and the 2.5 kids in a suburban household with the solid gender roles and, the hopes of the future as being getting a good, paying job with retirement. But kids were pushing back against that, right? But mainly it was middle-class white youth that were pushing back against this because they had it, right? They had those things that other people were fighting, to get access to. And so many of these middle-class youth are what would become hippies, right? People who are no, I'm against the system. I don't want to work for the man. I don't want to be like my mom and dad. I want to be, opposite of that. And that's usually kind of how youth culture goes, right? A culture of rebellion. But you see this rebellion, especially during this time, being within the midst of these really big, important political movements. All right, and then we're going to finish up this writing assignment for this week, reading about soldiers and the anti-war movement during the 1960s. And you're going to finish up by describing the inequalities and difficulties soldiers faced during the Vietnam War, using, of course, the reading. Okay, so do refer to the reading as you do this writing assignment.